Pandemic Recovery Office Technical Assistance Training. This training is going to be recorded so that the slides and the oration can be reviewed at a later date. Also, I've been told that the slides were passed out right before this meeting so that you have some documentation to go by as it's being presented. So again, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We hope that the first session was a good learning tool for everyone, and the next 7, including this one, will build on that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe Gorsuch, our partners at Deloitte, and he is going to get it started.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tommy, and welcome everybody to our second technical assistance session. Today's session will be covering pass-through entity requirements and start diving into those state and federal regulations that apply and some leading practices. I'll first introduce myself to those that I have not met. My name is Joe Gorsuch. I am on the Deloitte team serving NC Pro. As probably some of you know, I've been on those monitoring calls as we are in partnership with NC Pro conducting compliance monitoring for the State Fiscal Recovery Fund. And so while this deck will cover likely some of your questions regarding the State Fiscal Recovery Fund, there'll be some other more broadly applicable leading practices and citations that hopefully can be helpful for other federal grant programs. With that, I'll pass it over to Joe Simon to introduce himself, and then we'll dive right in.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Joe Simon. I've been working in grants for about 12 years. Usually I get called in to help states when they get big new grants that they need to tackle. I work pretty much exclusively with federal awards and really specifically with pass-through entity requirements. So read subrecipient monitoring. So I'm really happy to be here, and I do support NC Pro as well with Joe, and we've been on board since January of last year, if you believe it. With that, we have a pretty straightforward agenda for you today. We've got a quick overview, then we'll dive into applicable regulations. We'll have a knowledge check at the end, and some time left over for Q&A. So usually when we set up the grants environment, we talk about this layer cake where the federal government, the federal awarding agencies at the top, and then the pass-through entities on the second tier, and the third entity, the third tier or level is subrecipient. I wanted to introduce an analogy today that I hope will resonate, and it's one of a restaurant. So if you would, picture that you're with your friends and family, your loved ones, and you're going to a bustling restaurant which serves great food. It's downtown, kind of high class. It's a really nice place. It has an open air kitchen off yonder, and you can see right into the kitchen where these chefs, these highly trained chefs, are preparing your meal and all the meals for the restaurant goers. They're taking their time. They're well trained. You can tell that they're meticulously poring over each creation, and then they're putting it out on the board so that the server can pick them up. And now the server is a real professional. This isn't some college kid on a summer job. This is someone who's dedicated their profession to making sure that you, the diner, receive what you were asking for, and that the whole dining experience is a success. They're bringing the food from the kitchen, from the chefs to you at your table. Now, the analogy is that the chefs are the federal government setting up these grants, and the dishes themselves are the grants. And the pass-through entity is the server, and they're making sure that you get what you ordered, you get it on time, it's useful to you. It's a little stretch, but you're getting your check, which is a written agreement between you and the server. And they're giving you recommendations, which is like technical assistance, if you will. and they're monitoring the situation. They're making sure that you don't need anything, and that you're having a good experience, a productive experience. Hopefully that resonates. As we might come back to that. Let me know in the chat if you think that's a stretch. Now, pass-through entities, it's a non-federal entity that's providing a federal award to a subrecipient to carry out a federal program. Right? But those words sink in a little bit. Specific to the State Fiscal Recovery Fund, you've got NC-Pro, state agencies, and subrecipients are all pass-through entities. The pass-through entity receives the grant funds from the federal awarding agency and then awards those funds to subrecipients. That's what makes them a pass-through entity. Why is it important? Well, without reading these words, imagine all of those restaurant goers just running up to the kitchen, demanding their grants. It would be complete chaos, right? Not to mention, if you didn't have someone watching those people eat, this is getting to be a little stretch. Thank you, Neil. But if you didn't have some controls in place, then those restaurant goers would be doing all sorts of things that you probably didn't want them to do. But NCAC is going to help us define pass-through entity. It's going to let us know that pass-through entities are responsible for identifying the rewards, evaluating risk of subrecipient noncompliance, monitoring subrecipients to facilitate closeout, and meeting federal and state audit requirements. And the theory is that pass-through entities they're not the federal government way out in Washington. They're closer to where the grants are actually being executed. They know, their communities. They should have local insight, allowing them to effectively manage and distribute funds, where the federal government would not be able to do it to do that. Okay. So some of the benefits of having pass-through entities. I mean, not just because I'm a huge grants nerd and a big fan of the way our government is set up, but I do think it's an elegant way of governing. You couldn't just, this isn't a dictatorship. You couldn't just tell a subrecipient, you need to do this. The federal government doesn't have a heavy-handed way to execute policy. They have grants which are saying, well, you don't have to do this, but if you do want to do this, here's some money to do it. So pass-through entities are going to enable that process. They're going to imbue it with efficiency, flexibility, first off. So pass-through entities are going to be able to take resources quickly. They've set some of these grants are repetitive, and so therefore there are channels established, programs are set up, you have the infrastructure to get this money where it needs to be. But they can also distribute funds locally to an extent as they see fit, provided that they follow federal and state requirements. Then we have increased impact. And this goes to pass-through entities using their experience and knowledge to reach more people and communities than direct funding would. And of course, risk mitigation, back to the local knowledge and relying on local knowledge for effective execution. Pass-through entities allow federal agencies to avoid getting too involved in the complexities and risks associated with executing grant-funded projects. So yeah, in sum, your pass-through entities are allowing you more efficiency, flexibility, and better outcomes and reduced risk. All right, so take a second on this slide. Honestly, I love this slide because these three things, both according to NCAC and 2 CFR 200, are like the core requirements of pass-through entities. And if you work in state government and you're administering grants with subrecipients, you should be able to kind of rattle these off. These are like the three things that I consider among the most important for pass-through entity requirements. First off, you have to have that written agreement, commonly referred to as a subaward agreement, but also it can take other names like an MOU. That has very specific requirements. As per 2 CFR 200, it has to have certain information. We'll get into that a little bit in a few slides. You can see here the applicable regulation is that 03401 that Joe's going to talk about more, but 2 CFR 200 332, it's going to tell us what needs to go in that sub-grant agreement. And again, there's pretty specific things, and there is a lot of flexibility about how you can set up your sub-grant agreement with specific terms and conditions, for example. Crucially, one leading practice is to get these sub-grant agreements or sub-award agreements set up early on in the process. You don't want to be distributing funds and then have to come back and say, oh, wait, now come sign this. It really should be among the first activities that you're executing on for a new award. So once we have our sub-grant agreement, we can move on to a risk assessment. And that's where the pass-through entity is required to evaluate each subrecipient's risk of non-compliance with federal and state requirements. Joe's going to do a deeper dive in a few slides on the risk assessment. I would just say it should have risks criteria. It should rely on data, and the outputs should inform or enable your subrecipient monitoring, how you set up subrecipient monitoring. That said, it doesn't have to be super complex. Yes, we use an NC Pro engagement. We use a pretty robust risk assessment. It's data driven. It's risk based. It's a great tool, but I'd say the majority of risk assessments that I've seen have been data collected on a simple survey and just rely on simple math and a rubric that assigns risk scores to your subrecipients and then stratifies them so that you can say, you can make 3 buckets. This is high risk, this is moderate risk, this is low risk. And okay, now that we know that, this is how we're going to treat our high risk subrecipients, moderate risk, and so on and so forth. And then, as I mentioned, you must use the results of your risk assessment to inform your subrecipient monitoring. There are a couple of things about subrecipient monitoring. You have to review financial expenditure and performance. You have to check in on audit findings that are program specific to your grant, as well as your own, as the results of your own monitoring. So you can't just say you're doing a site visit. You can't just do the site visit and not follow up. You have to kind of see and hopefully help the subrecipient deal with whatever observation or finding that you've issued. So some of the leading practices here, a monitoring plan, and I really would pause on this. Having a plan for subrecipient monitoring, I feel is one of the best steps you can take to document your process. It's going to be a recurring theme, and not just in this presentation, but in all of this technical assistance series. You didn't document it, you didn't do it. And then the corollary to that is you documented it, now where's the documentation? Having that plan documents that you have fulfilled your pass-through entity requirements. We got together, we set it up, we thought about this strategically. These are the elements of our monitoring. This is how we're going to set up the sub-grant agreement. This is how we're going to execute risk assessment, and this is how we're going to do subrecipient monitoring. That's something that you can hand to an auditor and blow their socks off. Okay. So equally as important, even though I did have a preference for the last slide, but these are kind of 3 key things as well. So for pass-through entities, you have to provide technical assistance. It's a partnership, right, between the pass-through entity and the subrecipient. You all have largely the same goals because you want these grant-funded programs and projects to succeed. And any way that you as a pass-through entity can assist your subrecipients is going to be a great thing. I guess the the example is what we're doing right now. And thank you everyone again for attending these technical assistance sessions. So leading practices, developing standard operating procedures that you can share and kind of spread around. Holding regular training sessions, sounds familiar. And then communication, communicating any policy changes as they come down either from the federal government or from the state. And speaking of changes from the state, onto audit requirements. So you probably are aware that subrecipients that expend more than $750,000 in a fiscal year are required to undergo a single audit or a program-specific audit. This was changed in 2 CFR 200 last year, and I think adopted in NCAC as well last year. The threshold was raised to $1 million. And pass-through entities have to check in to make sure that subrecipients are actually having these audits, and then following up with any program-specific audit finding to make sure that they have a corrective action and they're actually correcting whatever the finding pertained to. All right, so leading practices here for audit requirements are going to be communicate your audit requirements with your subrecipients, and also tracking compliance. And finally, record retention. Can't say enough about it, and Joe's going to do a deeper dive, but you are required to maintain records as a pass-through entity, and your subrecipients are also required to retain records for 5 years from the end of the grant agreement term. So for state and local fiscal recovery fund, it's going to be December 31st, 2032, or until all audit findings have been resolved, whichever is later. So leading practices for record retention, making sure that documentation is readily available, making sure that appropriate staff have access to that documentation, and hopefully all documents can be centrally located in an effective way. All right, moving on to applicable regulations. So here we have some representative from our different entities, starting with administering agencies. These are pass-through entities, and they're required to monitor their subrecipients for the entire period of performance. And we have subrecipients, and subrecipients are your non-state entities receiving grant funding from pass-through entities to carry out the federal award. And they can also serve as pass-through entities when grant funding is directly allocated to a subrecipient. So a little something to note there. And then NC Pro is our, for state fiscal recovery funds, our prime recipient. And they serve as the pass-through entity to administering agencies and its subrecipients as well. It's a little more complex than the layer cake, but also very approachable. All right. So, Joe, can I pass it to you for the applicable state regulations?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is the fun part. And some feedback that we had received, I think, from the first presentation was to spend some more time on these applicable regulations. And so what we've done is sort of bifurcate the state and the federal regulations and what really applies to the state fiscal recovery fund. And Joe will take the next slide on 2 CFR. The groundwork that I want to lay here on this slide is that those state regulations, right, as part of the state's administrative code, are rooted in a general statute, right, from the legislature, 143C 623, which really mandates that there has to be a uniform administration of grant funds, right? That being the North Carolina Administrative Code. So as you'll see here, we are continuously citing and looping back to that piece of legislation, which feeds right into the administrative code. And so these requirements that Joe just covered, and in the previous slides, while they do have the regulations attached, I want to take some time to talk about, well, what are the key takeaways here for pass-through entities, right? And I think if we just go in sequential order here for written agreements, you can see the citation we have for the administrative code is the section is 0703, right? Not only does it say that, yes, there must be written agreements with subrecipients, but the administrative code clearly outlines the terms and conditions, at least at the state level, that should be flow down conditions and terms to be put into these subaward agreements, right, or subgrant agreements as they're oftentimes referred to. What's important to note is that, for non-revenue replacement projects, there's also a relation to 2 CFR here, in that there's an appendix 2 to part 200 that has additional terms and conditions that must be flowed down, right, into subaward agreements. Now, that's not the end all be all, right? There may be terms and conditions, right, at a more localized level or entity level, right? And we'll get more into how subrecipients, for example, of pass-through entities could have their own subrecipients referred to as sub-subrecipients, right? And so there might be even more stringent terms and conditions at that more local organizational level that should be flowed down. And so when in doubt, though, looping back to the administrative code for written agreements to look at those terms and conditions. Also, the state's procurement policy has that list of terms and conditions, at least for state agencies, is really important during that subaward agreement process. The second here, risk assessment, 0401 as part of the administrative code, right? As we know, for non-revenue replacement projects, right? You can see this part of 2 CFR 200-332 doesn't rise to subawards, but the state does talk about the definition of subrecipients and how risk assessments should be conducted prior to issuing funds, really to figure out, well, what's the monitoring treatment? And we'll talk about some maybe some ideas to share with you based on, how can we create a monitoring treatment plan? What are some activities that maybe we've, right, Joe Simon, done in other states that seem to work well in mitigating potential issues of noncompliance? Subrecipient monitoring, right, the crux of what we're talking about here today. Again, another citation here, that 0401 as part of the NCAC. That's specifically entitled Agency Responsibilities, right? It's the obligation to monitor subrecipients to support compliance with state and federal regulations, right? The part here that really sticks out to me is, right, it includes reviewing financial and performance reports, and we'll talk about that a little bit further down the line. But another piece too that I want to call out is that within the regulation, all pass-through entities, right, if you have subrecipients, must submit a monitoring plan to OSBM for approval and follow that monitoring plan, right, in terms of your monitoring treatment once you run those risk assessments. So take a look at 0401, specifically state agencies, for more details on that. But I think that's a really important call out. And 0401 also talks about financial reporting, making sure that expenditures are allowable, allocable, and reasonable, which should be part of monitoring and reviewing financial expenditures, which is part of what we're doing in coordination with NC Pro, right? Picking some samples and taking a deeper dive into the internal controls and financial management of your subrecipients. The 0401 also applies to performance reporting, right? Finishing up here, audit requirements. Joe just talked about the new threshold pursuant to 2 CFR, right? And that the state's uniform administration of grants is now pursuant to that, and will now continuously loop back to 2 CFR right? That section that's of the administrative code is 0205. It's called the minimum reporting requirements, and it includes the audit section there. We'll talk more about corrective actions and training and technical assistance and some other slides I'll cover, but loops right back to those agency responsibilities, right? You've got a responsibility to follow up on any audit findings related to the grant program and make sure that your subrecipients are taking reasonable and corrective actions to address those issues as soon as possible. Last but not least, training and technical assistance, like what we're doing here today, right? This is going to be a big theme when it comes to subrecipient monitoring, but it's all about giving the support that subrecipients need to deliver at the local level where we know the impact can be best made, right? Like Joe mentioned earlier, the way that the federal government set up, right, is to allow for these relationships to exist and for that flexibility to be there, but it also must come with support. With that, Joe, I'll pass it to you for the next slide.
Thanks, Joe. All right. So now let's take a deeper look at 2 CFR 200. And just to kind of orient folks that might not know, before 2013, all grants guidance was kind of dispersed around, documented in OMB circulars. And there was a big push. They formed the COFAR. They formed a committee to create 2 CFR 200, and what they did was they combined all that grants guidance, which, if you were an institute of higher education, you had to go to one circular. If you were a nonprofit, you had to go to another circular. If you were a state agency, you'd have to go to another circular just to find the rules. And it was really cumbersome, really inefficient. So they created one guidance to rule them all, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan. And that's what 2 CFR 200 is. It's the uniform guidance. And so just with that in mind, take a quick peek. Let's go through some of these requirements and talk about where they are and what to know about them. So we talked about the subaward. I don't want to keep switching on you. It's just they're known as different things. We talked about an agreement, subaward, subgrant agreement. You kind of got to know all those terms, but we're talking about the same thing. It's between the passer entity and the subrecipient. And that subaward information has really some specific information that you have to include, identifying that this is a federal award, for example. And each federal award has its own number. It used to be called the CFDA, Catalog of Domestic Financial Assistance, Catalog of Domestic Financial Assistance, CDFA. Now it's just called the Assistance Listing. But you could see that term as well. It kind of grants people get stuck in that and what they know. But that award listing number has to be included in the subaward. It has to be identified as a federal award. It has to have the amount and the period of performance, and it has to incorporate by reference or flowing down directly essentially all of 2 CFR 200. Just by labeling it as a subgrant agreement, it incorporates all of 2 CFR 200 essentially. So all of this is outlined in 332B. And Joe mentioned Appendix 2. That's where all your required contract provisions would be. And those contract provisions, I think there are around 14 of them. And it really depends on what kind of contract you'd be funding through the subaward. But that's where those reside. And then your requirement for monitoring and reporting is going to be in 332E. It's going to require you to implement a structured monitoring plan. That's what we talked about earlier. Conducting the subrecipient monitoring, and then reviewing performance and financial reporting, and as well as confirming timely corrective actions. That's all in 332E, if you want to check that out. It's all very approachable and readable. Like 2 CFR, don't be intimidated by it. You can search it very easily. Just when you do research into 2 CFR, always make sure that it's the .gov version. At the end of the URL, it should say .gov, because there are a lot of like law firms that try and trick you, try and get you to go to their website, and then they haven't updated it and all this. So just go to .gov. That's where you want to go. So that brings us to performance measurement and evaluation. That's going to be 2 CFR 200-301. And the important thing to note here is that you must define clear performance metrics and require your subrecipients to report on project outcomes and impact. Here's an interesting one. Internal controls at 2 CFR 200-303. It's going to require subrecipients and non-federal entities to establish a system of internal controls, and it's going to reference the COSO system, the COSO cube, but it's not going to require it. It's going to say you need to have something like this internal controls system that GIO created. Then you've got documentation and record retention at 334. And again, maintaining comprehensive records of all activities, all subaward activities. And it's going to tell you there 3 years from the date of submission of your final financial report. Then excluded or disqualified entities at 2 CFR 18300. It's going to tell you that pass-through entities, you can't contract with subrecipients or contractors or beneficiaries that are debarred or excluded. And then finally, evaluating risk of noncompliance. That's your risk assessment, that you're back to 331B. And that's just requiring you to do the risk assessment. And then it will go on to say, use the results of your risk assessment to inform your subrecipient monitoring. All right. And then a quick note, you see the footnote here. These 4 and then this one, these 5 with asterisks, do not apply under the revenue replacement. All right, because even though 2 CFR is the uniform guidance, things got really strange during COVID, and so CARES Act and ARPA, Treasury's version of Treasury's funding streams within those acts, they decided to kind of play around with what regulations should be applicable to those funding streams. All right, back to you, Joe, for risk assessment.
Alrighty, thanks, Joe. And thanks everyone for sticking with us through those regulations. I know it's quite a bit, but when it comes to pass-through entity requirements, there's a lot to know and a lot of moving parts. And so if anyone has any questions, happy to discuss at the end and talk through any examples or things that y'all are seeing in the field. And also to Eric's point, all questions will be posted on the website, and everyone should have received the slides in advance, and we'll have them at the end too to be able to reference that crosswalk of regulations. So bring it back to the risk assessment, right? How do we evaluate risk of potential noncompliance? How do we create a plan or determine how to treat our subrecipients, right? And that's the whole point of a risk assessment. It helps us determine, right, how to treat in a risk-based way each of our subrecipients from a monitoring perspective, right? And that should be documented in our monitoring plans. And so I sort of want to set the stage with, in more detail, rather, well, what makes up a good risk assessment? Well, there's 3 things I want to define here, right? And these are just ideas, some leading practices that anyone here can hopefully take away, is that what we've done in other states is we've looked at risk into 3 different categories. One being programmatic risk, second being compliance risk factors, and last being fiscal risk factors. And so let me define these for you. And I'll use some analogies and maybe some examples that'll really hit home. So the first, programmatic risk. I think a good question that we've asked in our risk assessments with NT Pro for SFRF is that are any of the subrecipients, right, using these dollars for capital projects, right? Why is that a potential risk? Well, maybe there are supply chain issues, right, or a shortage of contractors. And so that could pose a potential risk, right, of not spending the funds allocated as per the subaward agreement, right? Risk of non-compliance here, the second one, the second factor. A good example would be, does the subrecipient have previous audit findings related to federal grants, right? And maybe when you run your second risk assessment, right? Let's say you say your risk assessments are annual, right? And you notice, oh, wow, okay, they have a federal audit finding related to this very program. That should be a factor, right? Last but not least, fiscal or financial risk factors. A good one here, and we talk about this a lot, it's materiality, right? How much funding did the subrecipient receive, right? That could be a risk because if there's a lot of money on the table, that also means there is a timeline to spend. And so those are just some examples of those risk factors. And like Joe said, risk assessments don't have to be complex with tricky formulas, right? They can be basic and tied to a rubric that helps you come out with some outputs and some scores to make sure that you are monitoring through a risk-based lens, right? And so really the tools to have here are that, the North Carolina Administrative Code backed by, right, the state's legislative intent here with the uniform administration of state awards of financial assistance. I now know the NCAC changed that wording from state financial assistance to grant funds, which I think generates some broader flexibility. And then in terms of the risk assessment, just making sure that you're remaining flexible in the types of indicators that you're using, right? Doesn't have to be an end all be all on your first risk assessment. If there's other things that you want to add or even take out because maybe the impact is not so large or on the final scores, then you should have that flexibility in doing so. With that, Joe, I think we're good to move on to the next one. Great. Monitoring activities. So there's quite a few here, but the big takeaway, and I want to make sure we have time for questions and good discussion here. And this is, again, sort of based on the way that we have conducted monitoring in other states for other federal grant programs, such as the State Fiscal Recovery Fund and others through the American Rescue Plan Act, is that these are key components of a monitoring monitoring that really should be considered when drafting that monitoring plan, right? And if some of these things are missing, maybe it's a great way to improve, right, your plan over time. As plans should be revisited, probably on an annual basis, right? And then also implemented over the course of a grant program. So I'll give you a couple of examples, right? Debarment and suspension checks, right? There should be a procedure in place for, who's going to be conducting debarment and suspension checks on the system for award management, right? That's the federal government's way of saying, hey, let's make sure we're not giving money to bad actors, to people that shouldn't have federal funds. But then also the state, right? The state has a suspension of funding list, right? So a good practice is checking that list prior to issuing any funds to, right, a subrecipient and even vendors. And also, checking that state list, which I know there's an Excel export function, and I think that's updated very frequently, and there's a website for it. Another one here, monitoring activities would be issuance of observations and remediation, right? So documenting your findings during monitoring, even if there aren't any, right? even if there aren't any potential areas for improvement, let's say you've got a gold star subrecipient, right? Like, you've got to still document what happened to make sure that you can satisfy that requirement in the event of an audit. And remediation, right? What do we mean by that? Well, that flows down to technical assistance, right? If there is let's say, a handful of observations or pieces of guidance that you wanted to document with a subrecipient, there's got to be that support to make sure that the impact that's intended actually happens. And so again, we just want this to be a tool for everybody as to some of the activities that we've helped conduct and tailor really across the U.S. and are employing here in North Carolina. That, Joe, we can go on to the next slide. We're almost done here. We've got 5 more slides left. And so in the vein of sharing leading practices here, this will probably look very familiar to the way in which the Deloitte team in partnership with NC Pro is conducting compliance monitoring, right? I think Joe talked about in-person monitoring, some virtual monitoring, otherwise known as desk reviews. And this year we've actually leveraged a low-risk questionnaire, right? And so what we're doing is we're giving you some ideas of risk-based monitoring based on the results of a risk assessment, right? Otherwise known as a risk treatment plan, right? So for example, for high risk, right, going on site, meeting with grant administrators, those that are working on the projects with the federally funded, with the projects, right? Doing some financial testing, right? Digging through general ledgers, asking for follow-up documentation, purchase orders, invoices, proof of payment, right? Does everything tie out? Did they follow the procurement standards, right? Their own, which maybe are more stringent than that of the state, right? Doing that due diligence. The same applies for moderate risk, but maybe if they're moderate, you don't have to go on site, right? Maybe they don't have a large capital or construction project that could be riskier, right? That you would evaluate on site and document that it's actually being completed, right? And so moderate risk can take also many different forms. And again, these are just some leading practices and ideas, but the key theme here is technical assistance, technical assistance, technical assistance, right? Everybody should have that support along the way, right? There's going to be some grantees with more experience than others, right? And that should also feed into your risk assessment, or very well could. Maybe your experience in dealing with federal grant funds, right? And so if they don't have any experience at all, or they only have a couple of years, then maybe they're a higher risk because that gives you more time with them, right? Maybe you get to go on site and have those good conversations on leading practices and grants management. So again, we just hope that this serves as a resource and gives you some examples of risk-based monitoring, not only for this grant program, right, the State Fiscal Recovery Fund, but other federal grant programs in the future. Alrighty, Joe. Awesome. I know Joe talked about record retention, and if it's not a knowledge check question today, it definitely will be one in the future. So, and we also got a question in the chat about this. Please, please, please make sure you are keeping all records up until December 31st, 2032, right? That's the benchmark for 5 years after the closeout of the State Fiscal Recovery Fund. But nonetheless, if let's say there's an audit and your organization is part of that audit from, like, let's say the U.S. Treasury, that timeline might extend, right? As we can see here, that you got to keep this stuff until December 31st, 2032, but also, or until all audits really have been resolved and finalized. All right. We'll talk about the exceptions and access really more in the next slide here. Joe, if we can move on, I want to talk about some key takeaways here on just record retention, management system, staying compliant, right? What do we really need to know? Things that I've talked about with the entities that have been subject to monitoring and have met with the Deloitte team is that you've got to make sure the right people have access to information, and that information is in a centralized location, right? So if you are subject to an audit, there's readiness, right? it's available. You don't have to go looking through different servers and different file cabinets, right? Ideally, things are electronic to the furthest extent possible, right? So having electronic records, having a centralized system, identifying who has access to these records, right? Making sure, okay, payroll records are being pulled, right? Who, or procurement, right? Who from accounts payable can pull this stuff for me, right? Documenting that. That's also a good internal control, which will be a presentation in the future, little pitch there. But also have a plan in place too, right? A change management plan. Uh, what if that individual retires or they win the lottery? Which fantastic for them, but we still got to make sure that we have the right people that have access to this information. Have that plan in place. Don't put it on one or two or three people, right? Make sure that you've got a plan. So with that, let's finish strong here. We've got a couple more here. All right, addressing non-compliance. Right. So you'll see here we've got 2 citations. The first is from the state's administrative code 0801, which really discusses the steps for addressing non-compliance at the state level. And then you've got 2 CFR citation here, 200, 339. It's important to note that 339, those remedies for non-compliance, don't apply under revenue replacement, but the state's administrative code is pretty synonymous with the 2 CFR citation here. I think the most important piece to talk about for addressing non-compliance is in order of magnitude. If criminal activity or fraud is detected, right, as per the state's guidance, you've got to report that to OSBM, NC Pro as soon as possible. I know the state also has a fraud hotline, but reporting to NC Pro, OSBM, your grant manager, hey, something doesn't look right here, that's the first step, right? And then there are some steps moving forward from there that are outlined in the state's guidance that really should be adhered to closely. But what if it doesn't rise to the level of fraud or criminal activity? What if you've got somebody or a grantee, a subrecipient that's just not reporting on time? You're not getting the information you need, right? And then in turn, you're not getting the information to NC Pro that NC Pro needs to report to the U.S. Treasury on time. Now you've got this domino cascading effect that impacts everybody. And so you got to go back to the source, right? And we'll talk about some root cause analysis and identifying where the problems lie. But I'm going to use this reporting analogy or example. And yep, my dog picks that example too here. Sorry about that, guys. But for example, if you got somebody that's not reporting on time, right, taking corrective measures, putting some controls in place is going to be a really good practice. So, Joe, we can move on to the next slide. And if you hear my puppy here, she's just excited about pass-through entity requirements as much as Joe Squared and I are. So in terms of corrective actions, again, the first thing you want to do is, looking at reporting again, is doing that root cause, right? That root cause analysis. Maybe it's because the subrecipient is short-staffed, right? They don't have the resources or the time, or they have competing priorities. Maybe they don't have the right templates, right? And that involves reaching out to your subrecipients, reaching out to the stakeholders, right? Who's involved in that process, and then coming up with a plan with them, right? Not just on your own, but with the subrecipient to make sure there's a reasonable timeline and steps in place to get them back to compliance so that, again, you don't have that cascading effect.
This is just a webinar, no comment. Last year you just did normal. Is that what you'll do again?
All right, Joe, I think we're ready for the next slide. Awesome. Last but not least here, right, you've got to communicate what the plan is, right, to your subrecipient. If you have frequent or monthly check-ins with them, bring it up. And again, technical assistance is front and center here. Maybe there's a training or some templates that you can share for reporting requirements. And then follow up during the monitoring process, right? If reporting is consistently an issue, make sure that's documented. That's my best piece of advice here. All right, Joe. I think it's back to you for some questions.
All right, everyone, let's see who can get these 2 for 2. Put your answers in the chat if you would. It is time for a knowledge check. Our first question: which of the following is a primary responsibility of a pass-through entity? Is it A, conducting annual audits of federal agencies? Is it B, evaluating each subawardee's risk of noncompliance? Oh boy, look at these. Good. Or is it C, issuing federal grants directly to individuals? Another 5 seconds. Wow, looks like, yeah, people are, that's great. You guys really know your stuff. And it is B. Well done, everyone. Joe, you want to take the next one?
I thought that was going to be the tricky question, but yeah,
Everyone got
let's see
it?
it. Yeah, let's see it. Here's the next one. What is the threshold for requiring a single or program specific audit report for subrecipients in fiscal year 26? See answers coming in.
Got it.
Yeah, I think everyone's got it. Everyone's
Well
paying
done.
attention today.
Good job, or maybe they just knew. Well done,
Well, they knew
everybody.
it.
All right,
Well
that
done.
brings us to final section here, which is Q&A. Let's see if we have anything in the chat. I saw you were answering as we were going.
Yeah, there's one question I can resurface. If anyone doesn't have any other questions, let me just scroll back here. Joe, the question was, what rules apply when the primary award recipient is a cabinet agency? And then that agency subawards funds to a public university who is a member of the UNC system. Those are both state agencies. Interested in getting clarification that subrecipients are just non-state agencies.
So there's a hierarchy of grants guidance out there. It starts with the U.S. Constitution at the top, and it goes from broadest to most powerful. Obviously, the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and it goes down 8 levels down to your awards terms and conditions. And as you go up in precedence, and as you go down in you go more specific. So general to specific, and then like most powerful to weakest whenever there's a conflict. So I would say it doesn't matter that it shouldn't matter that it's a cabinet agency. The 2 CFR 200 should still be the code of federal regulations, should be the like guidance of record. However, if the state law has put additional, hopefully non-conflicting, consistent regulation laws on top of that, then that would be two of the elements to your regulatory set there. And I don't think it matters that it goes to a university. There are certain things in 2 CFR 200 that are applicable only to institutions of higher education. So that, I don't know if there are other thoughts there, Joe or Tommy, maybe.
Yeah, it sounds like a cabinet agency, I think, is being referred to as an administrating agency to another maybe office within, or in this case, university within the university system. That one's tough because I think it really depends on the nature of the work. I mean, if it's internally, then I mean, not really, because it's not a separate organization conducting part of the program. But let's say that money is given to another university in the UNC system, and then they go and get a subrecipient. Well, then the system office would be responsible for making sure that university is following those PTE requirements. I don't know if that's helpful, but feel free to chime in here, anybody.
Joe, I'm just thinking about this and thinking about the um, monitoring exercises that we've been going through for the last 2 years, and we still to this day, I believe, struggle with this. In my mind, to help keep it straight, I think first of all, you have to look at what does the federal grant agreement say? So with SFRF, it's the entire state of North Carolina that is the recipient of these funds. It's not just OSBM. It's not just DHHS. It is the state. So the state is the recipient, and every state agency within the state government is considered a co-prime. Then you have to look at, right, what has the General Assembly said for these specifications, and what does the North Carolina Administrative Code say in these situations? So I don't know if this helps the question or not, but I think that for SFRF, the entire state is being looked at as a co-prime recipient. And then it just depends on what does it say in the MOU? What does it say in the general statutes? What does it say in the administrative code? And you got to go through all of those. And if it's a local government, then you got to go through the LGC requirements. You've got to go through all of these and pull out the most stringent in the requirements. I don't know if that helps or not, but that's what helps keep it straight in my head.
Yeah, and I will add that this is Joy at NC Pro. For like the state auditor's office, when they did a performance audit of NC Pro, they did cite that we should be monitoring other state agencies. So again, I think it's like Tommy, it just depends on what they're looking at. But the expectation was that we should monitor our state agencies, which is why Deloitte is here now monitoring our state agencies. So just also keep that in mind.
Awesome. I saw another question in the chat that I answered. Is there anything else that we'd like to talk about? You've got us for a couple more minutes. All right, well, pass it back to Tommy and Eric for any final remarks.
Eric, would you like to close us out this time?
Tommy, you stole my thunder in the beginning. Sure. I just want to thank everybody. We had just about 200 people on this call today. It's really important that we reach out and we continue the education as grant managers, as good stewards of these funds, federal funds, state funds, and just be knowledgeable on the requirements that are put forth before us. I really appreciate the enthusiasm, one of our presenters, but of the participants in attending. So thank you very much for that. We look forward to next month's meeting. We'll send out another slew of invites. Again, we will have a PDF of next month's presentation as well with those invites. And like always, FAQs will be on the NC Pro website that's in the chat. As well as the slide presentation from today. So thank you everyone very much for attending. We really appreciate it. And folks at Deloitte, thank you very much for assisting us in getting this squared away and getting it out to the recipients here in North Carolina. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.